So I'm with an organization called the Carney Hill Neighbourhood Centre. We're a non-profit society that's been operating here in Prince George for just over 20 years now. We are located at Nesdayo, which is the Aboriginal Choice School here in Prince George, and have been with that school since its transformation into the Aboriginal Choice School. So our primary areas of service delivery are community-based. So we have early childhood education, preschool, childcare, all of that services located right in the school, as well as a community drop-in center about 3 blocks up the road. So when it comes to the education aspect of it, it would be the childcare programs that we run at Nesdayo. You know, I think fundamentally our aim is to work as hard as we can so that children and their families feel safe and included in all of our programming, that as sort of a transition from their experiences with us into the school, that, you know, we're creating a space that's really welcoming and, you know, really honoring of identity and diversity within our programming. Learning objectives are kind of the standard ones around health, nutrition, safety, development. You know, I think where we might differ and where our practice is maybe a little more expanded than other childcare centers and other preschool settings is, you know, really having a strong understanding of the history of colonization on the families that we work for, right? And really, you know, bringing in a trauma-informed lens to working with families, recognizing that there is a lot of hurt, there's been a lot of damage done through education, through interaction with community-based organizations, and still continues to happen, right? So, you know, we operate probably a lot more fluidly and ambiguously than maybe other centers might operate in working with children in early childhood education, and, you know, just a really strong understanding amongst the organization, both systemically and in our policies, as well as in the individual interactions with children and their families, that you know, we need to work harder to be more inclusive. Our center is quite large, so we take children from, the youngest we take is 15 months, that's our choice. We could take children from birth up to grade 7. BC childcare licensing policies doesn't allow children to stay in group childcare settings once they hit 13, so typically grade 7. We take children from the age of about 15 to 18 months through to grade 7. We've been and worked alongside the school as they transformed themselves from Carney Hill Elementary into Nesdayo, you know, sort of switching their pedagogy, switching their community-based philosophies, you know, and having that opportunity to work alongside them, you know. And I think, you know, because we know the value of relationships, that it's really important for us to have good relationships with our families. So many of the families that we support struggle to feel safe and included in sort of the larger society. A lot of times, right? You know, just from the day-to-day struggles of food security and income and everything else, but, you know, sort of those intergenerational struggles that have come through different governmental contexts that, you know, it's really hard to burn your bridges with us, I guess, right? You know, like, it takes a lot before we can support a family. And we really try to be as collaborative and inclusive as possible. You know, we work with a lot of families and a lot of children who are interacting with different ministries, or, you know, maybe protection issues, apprehensions that are happening, and trying to create safe spaces that if that's going to happen, how can we be as supportive as possible for the entire family, right? So that it's not a shaming, so that we're not participating in a shaming on the parents or the caregivers, that if, you know, this transition in their family status needs to happen, that we're always looking at the best interests of the family as a whole, and recognizing that the child is a part of that family, whether they live with them or not. You know, when it comes to sort of the content-based stuff, you know, sort of at a foundational systemic policy level is having, you know, Indigenous early childhood educators in the rooms, right? You know, that I can't even give, I would say probably 90% of our children and families identify as Aboriginal, and have varying levels of connection to their culture and identity. But, you know, having and working hard to recruit Indigenous employees, working hard to recruit employees who bring a diversity of culture and identity, you know, as well as just sort of intuitively knowing in a lot of ways what it means to be trauma-informed. Early childhood education doesn't have a lot of curricular content about trauma-informed practice. That's something you quite often learn on the job, especially within our center. So, you know, just sort of a natural caregiver instinct that comes in when working with these families. You know, and we have quite a diverse cultural group within our staff, which I think really brings an engaging sort of approach to working with children. That, you know, we have staff members from all over the world that bring in their own views of parenting and child rearing and discipline, and, you know, give us this opportunity and space to talk to each other about what it means and what that means in their cultures and what that means here in our setting. What does that mean in an urban Indigenous context with so many families who are disconnected from their cultural teachings, right? And operating within a public school system that still has a very kind of top-down disciplinary approach to education, right? So best practices, I don't know, I think we're awesome. Yeah, I think, you know, sort of foundationally, those are our two things, right? We're really having Indigenous educators in the rooms, having Indigenous content, just even physically in the building is amazing. Having that community connection to Indigenous families and their people that they see as leaders in their own communities, and then, you know, just bringing in that cultural competency from so many different ways of knowing. One, we measure it, it's all anecdotal for the most part, right? Like, we look at success on an individual level with the child and the family, right? Like, how are they doing? Where are they at? You know, we have children that come in, you know, they have hard time transitioning into a childcare setting, right? Or into a preschool setting. It's foreign, you know, expectations are different. And so, you know, okay, yeah, that first month is probably tough, but how are they after a month, right? How are they after 2 months? How are they at the end of the year when they're transitioning into another program? How are the staff, right? You know, are people burnt out? Are children burnt out? Are families burnt out? You know, we see a lot of families that, you know, we have their children in our programs when they used to be a child in our program 15, 18, 20 years ago, right? So I think that is a measure of success for us, that we've been able to maintain these long relationships with families in the community, that people trust us enough to come back with their own children. You know, and just seeing children happy when they come in, right? I think a measure of success for us is the relationship we have within the school community, that we work collaboratively together, that while we are a nonprofit society and a different entity within the school system, we recognize that we're all there to wrap around these children and their families to make them feel as much success as possible, right? To create as many opportunities that families can define their own success. You know, and even from my own perspective, I was a parent in that school years ago, and, you know, really seeing such a difference between both the child care center and the school community of, you know, being a parent in that school 20 years ago and really not seeing any community involvement to seeing parents and families and community in the building all the time, right? You know, and having, you know, just through word of mouth that we have a good reputation as a childcare center, right? People recognize we can do supported child development services. We can work with kids whose developmental, cognitive, neurobiological, behavioral needs might be higher. That we can do it without, you know, sort of reinforcing the stigma that comes with that, right? That, you know, we get called on a lot to support families that are struggling. I think, you know, it happens at so many levels. When I think of it in the context of what we're doing and the work that I do, you know, Indigenous education for us isn't curricular. It isn't about the content. It isn't about, teaching specific things to children or with their families. It's about that recognition of the role that families play in education, the recognition of the role that the community plays in education, the recognition of the importance of relationship and authenticity and engagement in education, that, you know, the children come from families full of knowledge already, right? How do we help translate that to systems that don't always help recognize that in ways that are going to help them have good experiences? You know, for the most part, most of them are going to go through mainstream systems that don't always honor and acknowledge what they bring. So how do we, as a community-based organization, make that happen? You know, and I think too, Indigenous education is a responsibility within a leadership context, that, you know, as educators, as leaders, as people who identify as Indigenous, you know, as caregivers, we have, you know, a responsibility to help create spaces for this to happen. You know, not a responsibility to bear the emotional labor of making this happen, that, you know, that has to happen with everybody, but responsibility to create spaces and to ask for change and to shake things up and have difficult conversations and to challenge the systems and the norms, right? Even, you know, at that really early childhood development level, right? You know, just even challenging systems and norms around screenings and assessments and hearing tests and why someone needs a referral to, you know, behavioral support, like, you know, so I see Indigenous education, you know, at a very personal level too, right? It's the role I play, and the role I play as a leader in creating space so that everybody in our program, staff, children, families, are engaging in those conversations and questioning things. You know, what I would really like to see, and I don't know other models, so I'm not sure what it is, but what I really would like to see is a very fluid system of movement for children and their families. A recognition that families are a part of the system. We're fortunate in our school, we've had the privilege of working in a system that's very inclusive of families. I know that's not all schools. So one, in general, just recognizing that what Indigenous pedagogies, what Indigenous methodologies can bring as best practices for everybody in all types of school systems. But two, you know, a very fluid and seamless transition from birth to graduation, right? That spaces can exist like ours, but bigger, right? So that children are coming in the door when they're very young, and they're feeling welcome, and they're feeling included, and they're learning, and they're celebrating, and they're having a great time, and then they're moving into public school, right? And then that's happening, and then they're moving into high school, and then that's happening, and then they're moving into wherever they want in the world, right? That, you know, there's spaces that can recognize that family systems can move together, right? You know, having that ability to have multi-age classrooms, right, where we're mixing our children, that, you know, that recognition from provincial licensing bodies that say kids of this age group need to be with only their age group, right, that we can lobby and find ways to recognize that natural mentorship and leadership grows through bringing kids of different ages together. And yeah, like I would just love to see this big, fluid, shapeless kind of system where children function, right, and where identity is celebrated. And, you know, especially within kind of the urban Indigenous context of Prince George, you know, working in an environment where there are so many nations and so many ways of knowing and so many ways of teaching and so many teaching staff and other staff who bring their cultural knowledge to the classrooms. You know, but again, just sort of founded in and recognizing of the ancestral territories that we're on, and always coming back to that place of where we're at. You know, a K to 12, like if it's sort of within the public school context, K to 12, birth to grade 12 process of where we're engaging families. You know, I think the steps that are happening are good, right? I think the call to action by the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and the steps that they put out about the inclusion of Aboriginal histories and Indigenous histories into curriculum, I can only sort of speak from the BC context because that's the one I know. Like, I think that's the first step, right? You know, and I think it's hard. Like, I think for me, so much of this happens at the individual level, right? It's really hard to change systems in meaningful ways. So it's, how do we create at the individual level comfort and confidence to really start learning our histories, to start having those conversations, to start recognizing our privileges and what it means to be, Indigenous or settler or ally or whatever it is, right? That, at a national level, my vision for Indigenous education would be that Indigenous pedagogies, again, Indigenous methodologies, Indigenous ways of knowing and being, are just recognized as best practice, whether that's for Indigenous scholarship or for any scholarship, right? That, these ways of learning will benefit everybody, right? And that there's an understanding and acceptance that while different, it is just as rigorous, it is just as theoretical, it is just as methodological as all other ways of learning and knowing. I think we need time. We need lots of time. We're seeing, program shifting. You see program shifting, content shifting, curriculum shifting, teacher training program shifting, that, it's going to take time. It's going to take 10, 15 years, a couple generations of teachers to really start to see the shift, because it has to happen at the personal level. It has to happen at the individual level. Like, we can impact that in our day-to-day lives, but to really see a big ripple effect, it's going to take time. So I think, one, we have to be patient, I think, two, we have to continue to push and to agitate in really meaningful and authentic ways to be heard and to be recognized, to, challenge systems that seek to, continue to oppress or stigmatize the children and families that we work with. Time, patience, we have to be confident enough to, like I said, to seek to agitate. I think, again, and this isn't about funding necessarily, but it's about shifting the way we value education and educators, right? That, so much of the fight is wrapped up in salary and income and what we pay people, and we don't pay people enough, right? We don't pay early childhood educators enough. So it's, how do we shift how people value the work that's happening, in that room with all the toys and the fun, and it looks like you're just hanging out with kids all day long, but there's so much more happening there, right? We're creating the foundations of how this little being is going to exist in relationship and community at a later age. So how do we shift that value societally? And I don't know, I think that has to change, and I'm not sure how that has to change. And, again, I think most of this is happening on the individual level. Prince George, I've seen go through some really awesome stuff, right? With, having Indigenous governance and leadership within the school district, with having the shift from, the school into the Aboriginal choice school. I think the resources exist here. I think the political will exists here. I think we, in a lot of ways, have really been kind of a role model for how other school districts have thought about shifting their platforms of Indigenous education and engagement. So, I think we've done lots. Can we do more? Always.